Putin seems to have problems, and therefore, so do we. We'll talk about 300,000 Russian reservists being called up, and of the I'm not bluffing threat of employing nuclear weapons, and help for people in foreign lands over Canadians. Fair or not? That and more on this week's Sherman Unlimited.
You wanted real talk, and this is where you'll hear it. Uninhibited by the toxic influences of cancel culture, unvarnished and unfettered, unencumbered by the censorship of traditional radio, uncontaminated by big media interests.
And now, Sherman Unlimited.
There's a lot that's been written and said about our illustrious Prime Minister delivering a version of Bohemian Rhapsody, the well-known Queen song, in the lobby of his London hotel where he and some of the Canadian delegation stayed when in London for the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. Why a Queen selection? Some say because Queen may have been a band, but Queen was also the person in whose memory Trudeau found himself in England on our dime. Hundreds of world leaders and dignitaries were there. Trudeau was the only one we know who donned jeans and a t-shirt and went to the lobby for public karaoke during his stay. It's believed by some to have been disrespectful. I'm no apologist for Trudeau, but I would just say it was untimely and dumb. Then again, his dad was once famously pictured sliding down a banister behind Her Majesty on one of his visits and performing a pirouette in another. I have little to add to what so many have weighed in on with this topic, but I do have a suggestion as the Prime Minister heads off to Japan for the funeral of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He might be thinking of something befitting of the environment in that country to honor the late Mr. Abe. An oldie but a goodie. Hey, why not? The answer to the question, why not, is actually simple. Because we, the people, send you, sir, in a private jet with your minions around you. You are treated like visiting royalty and you dine and sleep in style. We, here in Canada, get to pay for all of that. So if you aren't embarrassed by your own behavior, at least show a little respect for your benefactors, us. We want a serious person who shows gravitas by his presence anywhere as representing us. You are there for us, not for yourself, but for us. And also remember, it's not the first time you've neglected to act your age in preference to, say, your shoe size. Canadians are well versed in your escapades, not least that family trip to India where you embarrassed us and the Indian people by donning Indian garb and making a fool of yourself trying to emulate Indian dancing. When you make a fool of yourself, you make fools of us. We prefer to be taken seriously. On the subject of our Prime Minister, Dick Trudeau, yes, I know his name is Justin, but I prefer to call him Dick, he spent some podium time doing what he's famous for, handing out money to foreign lands at the United Nations, because, hey, after all, we have plenty of money to spare. Don't mistake me for being uncharitable, please. I just think charity begins at home. Dick handed over $1.21 billion to the Global Fund. It fights HIV, TB, malaria, and it's a 30% hike over our last pledge. He also handed Haiti another $20 million for rebuilding. So here's the thing. These causes are certainly not without merit. If I had endless wealth, or Canada did, I or we should hand over the money. But we don't. We have people, including kids here in Canada, who suffer from food insecurity and homelessness too. Our healthcare delivery is falling apart across the country. We need the kind of money Trudeau is giving away right here at home, and we need it now. If home is where charity begins, why do we pay higher and higher taxes so our Prime Minister can give them away? Lots of polls out this past week. Generally, my observations are that Canadians seem to think, at least for now, that the recent change in Conservative leadership presents options because Conservatives lead Liberals in the polls and in some sufficiently to take government if an election were held today. But there's another thing. Singh and his socialists in the NDP appear to have made significant gains too. Conservatives like that because the NDP and Liberals, while not the same, are both so-called progressive parties on the left. When they split votes, Conservatives come up the middle and win. Speaking for myself, well, I can only hope. I'm Peter Sherman.
In your face.
The world is watching as Russian strongman Vladimir Putin calls up 300,000 reservists who, it seems to me, don't really want to go to Ukraine. He also again raises the specter of nuclear arms use and says he isn't bluffing. In the streets of Moscow and other cities, we see video of people being carried away as they gather to demonstrate against this terrifying and unwanted leadership in that country as it attempts to decimate Ukraine before ultimately achieving its stated goal, or his stated goal, of repatriating Ukraine to Mother Russia. For Putin, Ukraine is simply an anomaly, a country that never should have existed. First, what is that monster trying to do? Why does he think Ukrainians are less entitled than others to determine their own destiny? Second, what happens if or when he achieves that objective and takes Ukraine? Does it stop there? Or is Vlad trying to pick up Humpty Dumpty, as it were, and reassemble his beloved Soviet Union by force? There's a lot more to the story of Ukraine than simply Russia wants it. If you'd like to hear it, look up this podcast, Sherman Unlimited, episode number 12. I spent a lot of time on that one researching Ukraine's modern history as it interfaced with the Soviets, and you may learn something about how far back and how dystopian this relationship has been. The concept of Ukraine really being part of Russia is about as ridiculous as the Brits sending a fleet over here and making war on Canada because we should never have become independent, right? But then Putin is ridiculous and would never be taken seriously if he didn't have vast armies made up of men he considers expendable and a storehouse of nukes which are a threat to any place on Earth that he decides ought to be on the receiving end. It was good to see that Russians, despite their restrictive laws, are prepared to put themselves on the line by flouting these repressive laws and going out of doors to demonstrate en masse, not just in Moscow, but all over the country. It's also good to see that a Russian singer of long standing has put her career and literally her life on the line by speaking out against Putin and the war. I don't know what you make of the ongoing reference to the Russian nuclear stockpile by Putin, but for me, that would be enough to trigger a Russian fifth column to take him out for their own safety. I've said before on this podcast that the concept of using nuclear weapons, for me, dates back to the days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when I was barely a teenager. Yes, I actually did see the famously laughable duck and cover instructional film while in school. And yes, I did hear the rising and falling of air raid sirens installed across all of Canada by the Diefenbaker government to warn us of incoming missiles or bombers. Frankly, as a young boy, I was scared shitless. I sometimes went to bed thinking I might not wake up the next morning because overnight, Russia might bomb my city and I'd be incinerated. That terrified teenager is now an aging adult citizen. I don't worry for myself anymore. I worry for my society. I worry for my children, and I worry for my grandson. They have the same rights to live full lives as I've had. People generally don't understand nuclear technology, and I'm not an expert, but I know a couple of things. The old nukes that I was afraid of still exist. These are the ones that are detonated several thousand feet above major population centers, literally extinguishing all life and demolishing all infrastructure within a radius of, say, 20 plus miles, and they wreak havoc for another time as much distance beyond. Those are the ones that, like the genie in the bottle, can and must never be released because there is no going back. It's basically the devil incarnate, the actualization of hell on earth, which takes us to the technical refinements of the last 50 or 60 years and the introduction of so-called battlefield nukes. These are small and tactical nuclear weapons that can take out, say, 10 city blocks. But they still release radiation that moves through the atmosphere to other places and people and herald the commencement of a lingering and agonizing death to those who are in its path. If these descriptions scare you in any way, they should. These weapons should never have come into existence. They are antithetical to life on Earth. I know one could easily say that war should never happen too, and that's something that I agree with, but we have war. What we have not seen since the release of Fat Man and Little Boy over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II is the use of nukes against civilian populations or anywhere else. And remember, those were firecrackers compared to what's been developed and stored ever since. Lastly, don't for a moment think that Putin would stop after taking down all of Ukraine. He'd just move on to Poland or Latvia or the Czech Republic. Hideous dictators like him are never satisfied, never stopped. I hope that the Russian people find a way to remove Putin permanently. He is a threat to them and to the world. The problem with Russians is they seem to have a need to be dominated by a czar, by a communist party, by a petty dictator. Russians need to do this, and Russians need to establish a truly democratic state where ordinary citizens can express and actualize their views. I'm Peter Sherman. About a week ago, a story made the rounds about a shop teacher in a school just west of Toronto who showed up for school wearing prosthetic breasts. This teacher is apparently a trans person who identifies as a female now, has a new name, long blonde hair, and let me just say it this way, absolutely humongous prosthetic tits. It's not transitioning that's a problem for the school or the students or frankly me, but I have a few things I need to put out there. I truly don't take issue with the trans community or any part of what is now known as LGBTQIA2S. I agree with the school board's policies that state in part that they're committed to establishing and maintaining a safe, caring, inclusive, equitable, and welcoming learning and working environment for all students and staff. The board also reminds us that gender identity and gender expression are protected grounds under the Ontario Human Rights Code. Quote, "The law recognizes that everyone has the right to self-identify their gender and that misgendering is a form of discrimination," reads an official explainer on the website of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. The Commission acknowledges that this requires some abrogation of the right to freedom of expression, but that no right is absolute. Now, I take no issue with any of that. Here's my sole concern. Back in what younger people like to describe as the olden days when I was in school, we didn't have any of this to deal with, but we did have some pretty hot female teachers. The boys liked when they wore low-cut necklines or sat on a front desk and crossed their legs. We were adolescent boys. We also took more than passing interest in bust size of both female teachers and classmates. None of that had anything to do with human rights or inclusion for LGBTQIA2S, which just wasn't a thing then. But it did have a lot to do with our ability to concentrate on our work. If this teacher has transitioned or is in the process, hey, knock yourself out. As the saying goes, you do you. No issue with that from here, but in my humble opinion, using prosthetics to simulate breasts needn't be taken to grotesque extremes by anyone of any gender. It disrupts class for the same reasons I've described. Basically, my classes were disrupted by what I saw. The classes now are disrupted by what the kids of today see. Nobody I've ever seen in my entire life has breasts of these proportions, much less the clear outline of large nipples on both sides. The breasts are the size of volleyballs, or so the photos depict. While the school's dress code states that students must be permitted to dress in a way that expresses their self-identified gender, they must also refrain from wearing clothing that exposes or makes visible genitals and nipples. So here's what I'm saying. If a teacher or student, for that matter, identifies as being of whatever gender, their rights are ensured and I don't question it. What I do question is the issue of taking anything to extremes. No one should or would have likely anything to say if prosthetic breasts in reasonable proportion to body size were part of this or of any person's appearance. But making those so-called full-figure girls look flat-chested does not appear to me to be what the board policy addresses or the distraction caused within the classroom workplace. It's not the boobs or anyone's gender at issue here. It's taking a policy and going well beyond the intent, thereby attracting undue attention, and that affects the rights of all. Students seem to agree as they're saying it's unprofessional and uncomfortable to be around. I'm Peter Sherman.
Sherman Unlimited.
Let Peter know what's on your mind. Drop him an email. info@petersherman.com.
Find future episodes wherever you find your favorite podcasts. So if you like what you've heard, tell a friend. If you really liked it, tell 3 friends. If you really hated it, tell 3 enemies. We'll talk again soon.